All right, for this first lab, we're actually going to go through this pretty step by step to get you a little bit more comfortable with PHP and how to do this. So what I'll do on this lab is pretty much talk you through it along the way and do it more as a tutorial. And then subsequent labs after this, you're going to have to think a lot more on your own, and my videos will probably just highlight some of the changes. So what we're going to do is we're going to start out with the two forms that were provided with you with the lab. And this right here is, I've renamed it schultzcart.php. And then the second one I've renamed schultzprocessorder.php. Pay attention to how I need you to name these in the lab. It helps me with some grading issues and might cause some problems if you don't name it properly. So be sure and pay attention to that. But these two files that are provided are straightforward HTML documents. This is a form that asks the user to fill in their first name, their last name, the product name they're going to buy, the quantity, the price. Now this is not really a useful real-world application, but it will get us started on some basic PHP concepts. And the second file we're going to use is what we're going to use to put our output after we've done our programming. So this is just another form that tells the name, the user's name, the date of order, the product ordered, quantity ordered, the results of our calculations, and finally the total due. So we're going to start out with this form, and we'll come back to this as we go because we'll have to come back and do some of the error handling when we check to see if they filled out things properly. We'll have to come back to this page and check to see if there are errors and display the error message if needed. But for now, what we're going to focus on is getting this form ready to send the information from schultzcart.php to schultzprocessorder.php, where we can do our calculations and then provide our output. So the form itself is ready to go. We need to do a couple of things. We need to change the method, and I'm going to go ahead and use post. Your book covers both the post and get method and the arrays that they create when submitting the variables. Excuse me. So be sure and review that because there are times when you need to use one over the other. In this case, we don't need to send anything via the URL, so we're just going to go ahead and use post. Now, I've added an action attribute to my form too. We need to tell the browser what to do once the user submits this form down here in the submit button. So we're going to set up an action that packages up all the data that the user has entered and then sends it on to our other form, which is, in this case, schultzprocessorder.php. So you'll just go ahead and fill in the name of what you've named your process order form. So that tells the browser what to do with the data. Now we need to go in and set up the names of our fields so that when we receive this data, we actually know what data we're getting. So we're going to use the name attribute here, and we're just going to change it to mirror what kind of data we're collecting. Now when we receive it on the other form, we might keep that name, we might not, depending on how we want to do that. I'm probably going to do a mix of both just to show you that it can be done. So for this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight text field and I'm going to change the name to fname. I'm going to change this one to lname. I'm going to change this one to pname, and I'm going to change this one to quant. And while I'm changing these to price, the last one to price, remember when you're choosing variable names in a programming language, you want to obviously follow the rules of the programming language which your book covers, but you also want to make sure that it's something that is easy to remember, and you'll recognize it if you have to revisit the code later on. So our form's ready to go. Our users are going to be able to fill in the information here. And so what we're going to do then is I'm going to go ahead and switch on over to schultzprocessorder.php, and I'm going to talk you through the ability to get your data from that first form into your second one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put some PHP programming before my HTML starts. To start PHP code, remember, you have to open up a lesson sign like you would an HTML code, and you're going to go ahead and put in a question mark in PHP. So I don't forget to close my PHP. I'm going to go ahead and hit the Enter key a couple of times and go ahead and close my PHP tag. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get the data from the form using the post method. And the // which turns my text to green here in Notepad++, shows that I'm doing a comment, just to remind me what I'm doing here, but also for teaching purposes once you get going. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up some variables here that I can use in the programming. In other words, I'm going to get the data off of the form and store them in a variable name inside PHP. And this is where I'll mix and match, either use the name attributes I set up on the form before or set up my own. So, and this drives me crazy because in a lot of other programming languages I'm used to programming in, you don't use a $ to start your variable name, but do remember in PHP that you need to start your variable name with a $. And so I'm going to set up the variable name first name, and I'm going to set that equal to the filter input function that is covered in chapter 2 of your textbook. And what this is going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to grab the data from the post array that was created, and then we can actually preset some filtering or some validation options. So I'm going to use input post because that's the method I used on my form. And then I'm going to tell it to grab the data that was in the fname name attribute, and I'm going to have it store it in the variable first name. Now if this failed, then the word false would be stored in that variable. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing with last name. I'm going to go ahead and do last name is going to be equal to filter input, and we're going to use input post, and I'm going to grab that from lname, which was the attribute name I gave the form on the HTML. Alright, so those are, I'm going to do the same thing with product name. Product name equals filter input, and you're going to have to bear with my typing, and I'm not going to edit these a whole lot because they take a lot of time, and if I spend too much time on them then you'll never get them in time to help you with your lab. So excuse all my likes, my ums, my sneezes, since I have a cold, my clearing of throat. Now notice I need to pay attention though. I have ProCut name instead of product name, so I'm going to change that real quick. Now on this next one, on our quantity, I'm actually going to do this a little differently. I'm going to choose the variable name quantity. I'm still going to do my filter input and my input post. Whoops. I'm going to tell it that it's stored in quant, which is what I chose for my variable. And then the third thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use the option to have it validate that this is an integer. That's one of the things you have to do in your homework assignment. So I'm going to go ahead and add filter validate int. And that allows you to have this check. Now what this does is not only does it check to see if quant was able to be stored in the new variable named quantity, but it also checks to see if it were an integer, if it were entered as an integer. And if it is in the integer format, then it'll take that value and store it in quantity. And I have a dash here instead of an equal sign. So it takes the value that was entered in quant, it checks to see if it's an int. If it does, it stores the value in the quantity variable. If it isn't able to validate it as an integer format, then it will store the word false in quantity. And so later on we can check to see what's in there, and if it's false we can give them an error message saying they did that incorrectly. And we're going to do the same thing for price, but this time we're going to check to make sure that it is in a decimal format. So we'll tell it to filter input, grab it from the input post array, that was stored in price on the form. And this time we're going to filter validate, and the option we're looking for is float. And there are other options that you can validate on and they are covered in chapter 2. So you need to go ahead and make sure you're familiar with those. So we have all of the values off of the form that we're going to need. We do need some other things down in our output. If you notice that we have date of order, and we're going to calculate some tax. And so what we're also going to do in this case right here is I'm going to go ahead and set up a variable named shipping. I'm going to automatically set that to 0 right off the bat. And I'm also going to define tax as a constant. And this is an important thing you need to know, that in a lot of programming languages, your value is not going to change during the execution of the program, that it's going to remain a constant throughout the program. And so you'll be encouraged to define that as a constant. And so, for example, we're going to define tax rate as a constant because our tax rate's not going to change while we're doing this. But later on, the city of Stephenville, state of Texas, might raise what our sales tax is, and as a result, we would need to go in and change this. If we have it defined as a constant in one place, then we just need to go into our code one place and change that when our value changes. So to define the tax as a constant, we do use the keyword define. And most of the time programming, you will put your constant names in capital letters, and then what you're going to do is put in the value that you're going to assign to that. And one thing I forgot to point out, and you'll get used to it as we go along, is most programming statements in this language, like a lot of other C-based languages, do end with a semicolon, so I will be including those. Actually, I'll probably forget one along the way, and we'll have to go back and check that error. But for now, what that does is allows us to use the value 0.0825 under the name tax rate in our calculations when we start to give our totals to our customers. So we have all of the info we need, but we need to make sure that these aren't empty and that these are in the correct format, and these are the ones that were included in your homework assignment. And so what I'm going to do, generally speaking, the logic of what I'm going to do is I'm going to validate the data, and set an error message. Okay, so excuse me. So what we'll do, and this probably isn't the best way to validate data. A lot of times you want to give the users all of the error messages at once, but we're going to do it one at a time just to make it a little easier. For those of you that are a little more advanced, all you would do would be to concatenate the error message to the previous one as you went along. So what we're going to do, following the rules of our lab assignment, is we're going to come in here and we're going to set up an if then else checkpoint, or check structure that allows us to check the data. If we find a problem, we set an error message, and then once we have an error message later on, we can then go ahead and go back and deal with that. So the first thing I'm going to check that your lab requires is I'm going to check to see if first name is empty, and I'm going to use the function empty, the built-in function, and I'm going to feed my variable first name into that function. And notice I have some parentheses issues because the if statement itself has to be in parentheses, and then because I used another function inside of that, I'm going to have double parentheses closing at the end. So I'm going to say if it's empty, and I put my programming statement of if it's empty inside curly, opening and closing curly braces. So if first name is empty, then I'm going to set up a variable named error_mess. I'm going to set that equal to whatever the error message should be if this validates as true. So if first name is empty, I'm going to have an error message that says first name must be completed. Then I'm going to check my next thing. I'm going to do else if, and I'm going to check to see if last name is empty. And if it is, then I'm going to set my error must equal to last name must be completed. And then I would probably check product description, but since I didn't include it in the instructions for the lab, it's okay if you skip it. So now what we're going to do is we're going to check to see if our quantity problems had a problem. So remember, if it validates as an integer, it'll put the value in there. But if it doesn't validate as an integer, then it's going to put the word false in capital letters in quantity. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to say else if quantity, and you need to spell it right or you will get a syntax error. So if quantity is equal. Now remember, in a comparison, if you use a single equal sign, it assigns values. So to check for equality, you're going to use a double equal sign. And when you're checking for true or false, which is a Boolean type, you're going to use the capital letters of false. So we're checking to see if quantity has the word false in it. And if it does, we need some curly braces. If it does, then we're going to set the error message to quantity must be an integer. We're going to do the same thing for our price. We're checking to see if it also failed, so we're going to do price equal to false. In other words, it didn't have a decimal point in it in this case. We're going to set our error message equal to price. Oops, I have a double quotes. Actually, you can interchange double quotes and single quotes. I'm going to stick with single quotes because that's what your book uses. And just to make it consistent. So price must be a decimal. So at this point, that's all we had to validate according to the instructions. So if all of those pass, we're going to have an else message that sets error message to blank. So we're going to do single quote, and then close that programming statement. And so what we'll do after that is when we do our error handling, we'll check to see if error message is not empty. If there's something in it, then it needs to go back to the main page and show the error message handling. So I'm going to finish that part of the program, and then I'll probably stop this video just so you can take a break, check for errors, play catch up, whatever you need to do. So we have our error message stored. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check one more thing. I'm going to see if error mess is not equal to that single quote. Because if it is equal to that, then the rest of our program needs to run here. But if there's anything in there, we need to send it back to our form page and display the error message. So what I'm going to do, and this is covered in your book under how to change the control of the page, is we're going to send the control of this back to our main page. And so we use the include statement, and inside that we tell it what we're going to send it back to. So in this case, we're going to send it back to schultzcart.php. And then you're also going to exit this part of the program and send control back there. So at this point, what happens is if any of these turn out to not be the right way to fill out the data, first name's empty or the quantity's in the wrong format, error message will be filled with something. If it's not, if it made it through all those checks, then error message is equal to nothing. So then what we do, we say if error message is not equal to nothing, it's kind of negative logic, but in other words, if there's anything in error message, then we're going to go back to schultzcart.php and we're going to send control of that back to our form. So I'm going to switch back to our form. We're going to go ahead and add the error handling to that form, and then we're going to go ahead and stop the video and I'll start up the rest of the ones in the next video. So back in schultzcart.php, what I'm going to do is right after the H1 here, I'm going to open up a PHP tag, and I'm going to go ahead and close it down here just so I don't forget to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to start here and we're going to say if, and we're going to use not empty, and we're going to check error mess. Okay? So we're going to say if the error message is not empty, then we need to show what's stored in error message. Now the the syntax is going to get a little weird here because we're going to mix in some HTML inside this. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to open up my curly brace for my if statement, but then I'm going to close my PHP statement, because I'm then going to come in and put in some HTML code. I need to tell the browser stop doing PHP and at this point do regular HTML. So I'm going to go ahead and add an inline style just to make my error message stand out a little bit more. I'm going to make it red. And let's see, let's make it a little bit bigger. Let's have a font size of 18 point. Is that all I want to do? Yeah, that's all I want to do. And so I set the p tag for my error message. I set the style in the p tag. So now I need to open up my PHP tag again to tell it that I'm going to do some more coding. And I'm going to use the echo statement, and that allows me to echo out what is stored in a variable. Now I'm also going to use the HTML special characters, which you'll need to review in your textbook as well, because it talks about how that makes the application a little bit more secure. And what I'm going to feed into that HTML special cars is our error message itself. So I'm going to close my PHP tag again. I'm going to close my P tag for my HTML. I'm going to, like I said, it gets a little weird. I'm going to open my PHP tag back up so that I can get my closing curly brace in, and then I'll close my PHP tag right there. So what this does is on my page, if I had something in the error message, it goes back to schultzcart.php. We have to check to see if it is empty right here, because the first time you use this page, obviously it's going to be empty, and so you just want it to go on down and start showing the form. But if there is an error message in there, it's going to open up a p tag with this style. It's going to echo out what the message tag is. It's going to close the p tag. It's going to close the curly brace from this if statement, and then it's going to close the PHP tag again. And then it will show the form. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there, and we'll come back and finish the calculations and do our output on the second part of the lab.